Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. I'm also an NHS doctor. You can call me the ominous Shahaminous. Now, Ted Bundy was a serial killer. He sexually assaulted and murdered more than 30 women and girls across the United States. Yet, he had admirers who sent him marriage proposals and even photos of their naked bodies. So for younger viewers, I should just explain that before dick pics, perverts had to actually go and take physical photos, get those photos developed in a shop in what I can only imagine was a very awkward exchange. Groupies attended Bundy's trials dressed like his victims. They bombarded him with fan mail and they gathered outside a Florida prison on the day that he died in an electric chair. Bundy even married one of his admirers and had a daughter with her. Her name was Carol Ann Boone, and she started a relationship with Bundy whilst he was on trial for murdering 2 university students. She even testified as a character witness for him. And Bundy, who represented himself in court, proposed to her whilst he was questioning her in what I can only imagine was a court hearing that was even more awkward than going in and collecting naked pictures of yourself. And their marriage was later made legal, and Boone gave birth to Bundy's daughter named Rose in 1982. So this video right here is exploring the psychological analysis of women who fall in love with killers. What are their motivations? What are their character traits and personality traits? What is hybristophilia? And by the way, it's not an obsession with a toothbrush. And I'm going to explain all of these things and many, many more. So sit back, relax, grab your bunny and your boiling pan of water, and welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. Okay, so I've mentioned Ted Bundy, but there are also other high-profile murderers, including Charles Manson, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez, who were sent letters and gifts from women all over the world. So why? Let's have a think about that. To me, the Dahmer case is extremely shocking because these pure, kind-hearted women managed to look past the cannibalism, the serial killing. He killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. They looked past the sex offending, the dismembering. They even looked past his own sexuality, and they still swiped right. In a more recent case, there's the family killer Chris Watts, who, if you're a true crime fan, I'm sure you've heard of. He strangled his pregnant wife, Shanann, smothered his 2 daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, at the age of 3. By the way, if you're interested, see my video on the psychoanalysis of Chris Watts if you want to understand how his mind works, and if you want to learn about that, or see Dr. Grande's video if you want to be completely confused. So Chris Watts received love letters and photos from female admirers. Even now, he gets sent when he's in prison, where she's in there for life. One even sent a photo of herself in a bikini to Chris Watts whilst he's in prison. So think about it, right? Your husband, he never does the dishes. He's put on a few pounds, I think is fair to say. And when you lift the duvet up in the morning, it kind of smells like you've walked in on a dead body that hadn't been discovered for 3 months. But let's face it, it could be worse. Enough foreplay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the psychological explanations for the actions of these women? I'm making this video and I'm telling you these things because I want to educate you so you start thinking like a forensic psychiatrist, also to take over the world, but we'll come on to that. Some cases involve women that actually have a mental illness, so they might have something like a psychosis. So a psychosis is where you step out of reality. Often there are 2 types of symptoms. There are hallucinations, such as auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, or delusions, which are fixed, false, unshakable beliefs that don't make sense. So for example, I've seen a case of a lady who fell in love with a man who was in prison because she believed in her delusional mind that he was doing God's work, and she suffered from something called erotomania, which is the delusion that her and this man were in a relationship and that he loved her. He'd never even heard of her, he'd never had any communications from her, but she was convinced about this, and she felt that he was like telepathically communicating with her. This deserves its own category because I think it's fair to say that these women are, they're mentally unwell. They're not making a rational choice. It's not really their fault. And also, this is an extremely rare presentation, so we can just sort of park it to the side. I just wanted to give it an honourable mention. Much more common, but slightly uncomfortable, is women that have a history of trauma. So they've either been physically, sexually, and or emotionally abused by a partner or by their parent. So they want to repeat this kind of cycle, either subconsciously or intentionally. And so unfortunately, these women tend to gravitate towards what's familiar instead of what's safe. And we see this phenomenon in victims of abuse. Sometimes they become abusers themselves. And also it's quite a well-known kind of social intricacy that tragically some young girls who witness domestic violence as a child, perhaps their father towards their mother, they pick abusive partners when they become adults themselves, partly because it's ingrained in them to see violence as a way of conflict resolution, and they are used to the fact that there's a power dynamic within relationships. So ironically, these women feel safe in their relationships with killers because even though what they've done is bad, these guys are behind bars. So that means that these women can actually control and dominate the relationship. Maybe for the first time ever, they feel that they have some power in the relationship after a string of abusive relationships. So what I'm saying is these women, they're on the outside and the killer is on the inside. So they can kind of call the shots. They can make some of the decisions, such as the visiting times, such as giving the killer items. So she knows where he is at all times, and she knows that he must be thinking about her, that he's got less options in terms of romantic opportunities. You know, he's not going to be cheating on her in prison. Well, actually, I suppose he could be cheating on her in prison, but he'll probably be walking funny afterwards. What I think is quite interesting about this is that there's a sort of psychological paradox to me. So these women are attracted to dominating and manipulating men who can be quite violent, yet these women themselves want to take control and ownership of the relationship. There are other cases where the women feel that they could save or transform the prisoner or the killer. So they see it as a challenge, and they have these like overly mothering instincts. Maybe they were smothered by their own parents. Maybe they had this kind of moral framework thrust upon them and forced upon them. So they're kind of rebelling in their own way by taking on these cases as such, these charity cases in their minds. And also another element of the challenge is they believe that they can change or they can heal a man or as evil and as damaged as a serial killer. I think another element is the illogical kind of biological instinct. So for example, research on primates find that females prefer the louder, larger, more aggressive male who expresses his manliness, and they see them as more virile, having a better chance of fathering more children and better protection out in the wild. So I think that sometimes in humans there's this innate sense, and it's stronger in some women than it is in others. I think another psychological aspect is that some of these women have this kind of notion of a perfect relationship. So they don't have to endure the day-to-day issues that are actually involved in most relationships. They don't have to go through the mundane stuff. There's no laundry to do. There's no need to cook for him. There's no smelly socks left on the staircase. And I know I said I'd put the battery back in the smoke alarm, but I've just been busy. I will do it. Sorry, I think I just had a flashback there. So what I'm saying is these women can keep the fantasy going for a long period of time without having to go through the chores of the relationship. Okay, let's move on to some of the juicier stuff. I think it's very fair to say that some of these women do this because they want to search or crave attention or fame. And in extreme cases, this is a phenomenon called Hybristophilia, otherwise known as Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. Let's face it, it sounds far cooler than the Rose and Fred syndrome. Okay, before I explain to you what Hybristophilia is, I've got a question for you, my Psych for Sore guys and gals, which is this. Which philosopher said the following words? If I get locked up and sentenced to a quarter century, could I count you to be there to support me mentally? If I went back to a hoopty from a Benz, would you poof and disappear like some of my friends? If I was hit and I was hurt, would you be by my side? If it was time to put in work, would you be down to ride? So who was it that said those very intelligent and clever and deep words, answers at the end of this episode? Okay, let's get back to the Concrete Streets original beats. Hybristophilia is a sexual interest in and attraction towards those who commit crimes. It's basically liking a bad boy. So the term is derived from the Greek word 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 𝐏𝐵RIAZEN, which comes from the word hubris. Any Greek listeners, you can mock my pronunciation in the 𝐏𝐸𝐻 below. And the word philo, which is Latin for pastry. Sorry, philo, which is Latin for having a strong affinity preference for. So, hybristophilia in itself is not an official diagnosis, but it's a type of paraphilia, which is previously known as sexual pervertism and sexual deviance. So that phrase, paraphilia, is an official term in ICD and DSM. And paraphilia in general is like an intense sexual arousal to atypical objects, so things that the average person wouldn't find normal. So that can be situations, fantasies, behaviours, particular individuals. It can be towards feet, or it can be towards, I don't know, dressing up in a nappy and being spanked. So I've heard. There are actually examples of educated women with careers, including lawyers, and barristers who fell for or have married killers who will either be sentenced to death or will never be released. So I guess my point is that it's not just like a phenomenon for a certain social economic class. It can be any woman from any background. So in my opinion, much of this is connected to celebrity worship. And some women have done this very overtly, so they have clearly hoped to share some of the media spotlight or to get a book deal or a movie deal afterwards. And let's face it, there are a lot of attention-seeking, fame-hungry media whores out there. Not me, I'm legit. And I think that this kind of the recent trend in true crime is feeding into this obsession. And this is all kind of psychologically linked, in my opinion, to conflating being famous and being infamous. And I think that's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's something that we've seen grow hugely in front of our eyes for the last couple of decades. So we see it in reality TV stars, and they often become famous just for the sake of fame. And I think that the public feed this, and we're at part to blame. So attention and controversy overrides actual talent. And you can see this in so many different sort of areas. We have YouTubers who fight has-beens, and they draw far more attention, they draw bigger crowds, they draw huge payouts compared to actually talented, skilled boxers. Now, I just want to make this clear, I'm not insulting reality TV stars, I'm just calling them talentless and vacuous, but I'm doing it affectionately. Also, I just wanted to use that word, conflating. Right, so far we've dissected the character traits of the women, but what about the actual character traits of the serial killers themselves? How do they tie into attracting women? I think that's something we need to look at. Before I do that, I just want to introduce you to this channel, A Schmeich for Small Minds. It is a smorgasbord of videos related to true crime, psychiatry, mental illness, and the crossover betwixt the two. I've done other cases recently about Casey Anthony, about Andrew Tate, Harold SHIPMAN. I've dissected many of them, some of them with my homeboy, DEADbug. I am your third favourite London-based Asian gold-toothed forensic psychiatrist on YouTube. I implore you to subscribe to this channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it will reduce the stink factor of your husband's flatulence, guaranteed all your money back. Okay, back to the video. So the question was, what are the character traits that some of these serial killers have to attract women? Well, I think it's fair to say that many of them are psychopaths and narcissists, and those groups of people often attract women because they have the ability to be charismatic and to charm vulnerable people who are susceptible to this kind of manipulation. So as I've said in other videos, narcissists are very grandiose and they're very entitled to things like sex and relationships. Psychopaths are the same, so they have this inflated self-esteem, but they're also very charming and they're calculating and they're quite devious. So they're very good at knowing how to act and what to say to make the women feel special, to feel loved, to feel privileged, to feel that they're part of like some sort of special bond, and it's me and it's the killer and the woman against the world and the whole system's against them, etc., etc. By the way, if you're interested, I've got a video on my channel about the difference between psychopaths and narcissists, and I've got an entire different series on psychopaths, including ones that I've assessed and rehabilitated myself. All the links in the section. The psychological analysis of women who fall in love with serial killers. So we've learned about what are their motivations, what are their specific personality traits, and the personality traits of the perpetrators that attract them. We've answered the question, what is hybristophilia? We've learned that I will eventually put the batteries back in the smoke alarm if you just give me some time. And finally, I just want to shout out my homeboy DEADbug. Of course, I cannot finish without telling you the answer to the question, which philosopher said, if I got locked up and sentenced to a quarter century, could I count you to be there to support me mentally? It was, of course, my homeboy, 50 Cent. If you got that correct, then buy yourself a cookie and you can bill me. That's all I have to say. Stay euthymic, subscribe. I need some more subscribers. I have a very fragile ego and I wasn't hugged enough as a child. Buy my goddamn book and please do not forget whatever happens. I love you.